Good afternoon from Columbia University's Harriman Institute. My name is Tanya Domi, and I am an adjunct professor teaching in our Balkan Studies program. The Harriman Institute at Columbia University is one of the world's leading academic institutions for the study of Russia, Eurasia, and East Central Europe. Our mission is to serve our community at the university and beyond by supporting research, instruction, and dialogue, sponsoring vibrant and multidisciplinary events that bring together our extraordinary resources of faculty, students, and alumni. We are committed to training the next generation of regional specialists to play leadership roles in setting the academic and scholarly agenda, making policy and challenging accepted truths about how we study our rapidly changing world. I welcome everyone to today's event with the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, who will present its poll of Kosovo citizens surveyed last year following their national elections that returned Prime Minister Albin Kurti to government, along with President Vjosa Osmani, the former Speaker of the Parliament. I am delighted to welcome back Robert Benjamin to the Harriman Institute. Rob is the NDI Senior Associate and the Regional Director of Central and Eastern Europe Programs. I also welcome Elizabeth Saam, who is the Senior Program Manager for Central and Eastern Europe Programs at NDI. She oversees in-country programs in Kosovo and regional political party integrity programs. And also Brooklyn Richards, who is the Program Associate for the Central and Eastern Europe programs at NDI. She supports in-country programs in Kosovo, as well as regional programs in the Western Balkans on religious freedom and democratic resilience. I am also delighted to welcome back Agon Maliqi, who is a policy analyst and civil society activist from Kosovo with a track record of working on topics related to democratization, development, and ethnic reconciliation in his home country and the broader Western Balkans. During this event, please submit your questions in the chat, and we will respond to them following the presentation of the poll. So over to you. Rob, do you want to make some opening remarks?
Thank you very much, Tanya, and to everyone, a good afternoon, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I will just offer one or two general introductory remarks on NDI itself, and then I'm going to turn to Elizabeth and Brooklyn, who can talk more about Kosovo and our public opinion research and the programmatic context in which that takes place. NDI, National Democratic Institute, is now almost 40 years old, having been founded in 1983 with a mission to support democratic processes in countries around the world. And we now presently have programs in about 60 countries with offices in those countries. And our work really focuses, as I like to say, in the space between government on the one hand and citizens on the other. So that space is occupied, democratically speaking, by elections. It's occupied by institutions such as civic organizations and political parties, parliaments, of course, as a representational institution combining government, citizenry, political parties. And we do a lot of work in and around those institutions and processes when it comes to promoting good governance and things like anti-corruption, when it comes to promoting inclusion on the basis of gender equity and equality, and also the inclusion of communities that have long been underrepresented or not represented at all, such as LGBTI, or in our region of Central and Eastern Europe, Roma communities and others. We work a lot with young people in the midst these efforts. We're paying a lot of attention these days to disinformation as well as affecting all of the electoral, legislative, and political processes that we see. And virtually everything I've just mentioned is housed within our Kosovo portfolio. NDI was able to start our Kosovo programming right at the termination of the conflict in 1999. I and a few others went to Pristina in July of 1999. I have fond memories of what was a very dramatic and, in a certain way, exaltative period of having that conflict end, people returning to Kosovo for having been expelled or having fled ethnic cleansing or worse. I remember distinctively almost being run over by Bob Dole's convoy as a lot of senior American officials came to lend their support and guidance for what has become now a 2-decade process of Kosovo's sovereignty, independence, and growth as a society, as a democracy, as a new country seeking to complete its place in Europe and the transatlantic community through its own democratization process, which we're going to focus on today, also with respect to the very important process of securing lasting peace and mutual recognition with its neighbor Serbia. And other dimensions to all of this. So I'll finish simply by saying that Kosovo for NDI is well, it reflects our institutional commitment, not least personified by Secretary Madeleine Albright, who did so much as Secretary of State to end the conflict and help secure the peace to allow Kosovo to move forward. Proudly, she is the chair of NDI's board, having retired her position at the State Department now for about, 20 years. And in that capacity as NDI's chairman has continued to support and champion and lead on NDI's efforts in Kosovo, which we're really, really proud to have. So I'm going to turn to Elizabeth, and she will then introduce the research, again, in the context of our portfolio and the contemporary political situation in Kosovo. Thanks much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Tanya. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. As Rob said, I'll talk a little bit about NDI's work in Kosovo and set the scene for the political context, really, in which this poll occurred last year, before passing the virtual mic over to Brooklyn. As Rob mentioned, NDI has been in Kosovo since 1999, helping to support a variety of democratic institutions and democratic growth in the country, all of which really contribute to the ongoing peace and security of Kosovo and, frankly, in the region. Through those years, we've been very happily funded consistently by USAID, who is one of our primary donors now through the Consortium for Elections and Political Processes. In fact, they funded this poll that we'll be talking about today. So we owe them a debt of thanks as well. We also have funding from the National Endowment for Democracy and State Department's Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. And across all of those programs, what we're doing in Kosovo now is helping leaders and activists understand and devise responses to disinfo and other harmful forms of information, especially violence against women in politics, which is unfortunately quite prevalent in Kosovo as it is in the region. We support the Assembly of Kosovo, which is the parliament to once upon a time establish and now sustain and advance some of the core parliamentary support functions like independent policy research and independent budget analysis that are so critical to effectively making laws and overseeing their implementation for Kosovo and its citizens. We work with political parties to help them conceptualize and make real opportunities to really listen and respond to citizen concerns and help them set up mechanisms so that they can do that in a systemic way and in a way that includes all levels and all aspects of their political party structure and citizens of Kosovo. And speaking of all citizens of Kosovo, we especially work with up-and-coming women, youth, and minority leaders to elevate their presence and their skill set and build out their networks so that they can put themselves forward more confidently and even more capably than they were already able to have meaningful participation both in those parties and in all elements of Kosovo's democracy, which means we also have to work with political party leadership to make sure that that space is being made and systems are changing to better support that participation. And as we also support interreligious and interethnic dialogue and collaboration. We have programs that focus specifically on non-Serb minority leadership, which is a group that's often overlooked when we think about minority representation in Kosovo. And we examine ways in which good governance and civil society can work on anti-corruption and a host of other initiatives. Polls like this one through our SEPS program funded by USAID help us guide all of those pieces of the program. It helps us assess for ourselves, where are their openings democratically, where are there rising challenges democratically speaking, and then to take this information to civic leaders, political leaders, and those up and coming activists so that they can better understand the concerns and priorities that the people of Kosovo have. So, and then how they can take that information and translate it into good governance action in any number of ways. So this poll, which we'll share just a few slides of today and talk about some of the trends we're seeing, it is also available on our website for those who want a deeper dive at any point. But this poll was conducted across Kosovo with a representative sample in April and May of 2021. So what was happening at that time is that a new government had just been formed following February parliamentary elections. Those elections, as Tanya mentioned, saw the return to power of Vetëvendosje, which is a political party led by Albin Kurti that had previously governed once in Kosovo for just under 60 days. And this election and therefore this poll also followed a pretty turbulent fall period for Kosovo in November. So just less than 6 months before this poll, the leader of PDK and at the time president of the country, Hashim Thaçi, and others in PDK, one of the major political parties in Kosovo, leadership were called to The Hague for inquiries related to war crimes. And unrelated to that, the Kosovo government did collapse in December, which prompted these elections. So if we think about the poll in that context, Kosovo is just coming out of a period of turbulence, kind of literally and figuratively cold and dark winter of COVID struggles, and they're just starting to see vaccines come into the country, right? If we stretch our minds back globally to as the very first vaccines are distributed, especially to priority groups like healthcare workers and other first responders. So we saw some changes in those elections. A historic growth for LVV, who for the first time for any party in Kosovo's history secured a parliamentary majority. We saw a change in faces in politics because of that large win for Vetëvendosje, and also because leadership in PDK was gone, and so PDK had to fill its ranks. We saw a record number of women elected, and we'll talk about more about gender dynamics in Kosovo a bit later. And we're seeing Kosovo at this point in time kind of poised to maybe resume dialogue with Serbia, albeit with perhaps a different positioning coming from the new government. So in this context, let's talk about that dialogue and how people are seeing it. 1/3 of people, when we polled them, saw that dialogue with Serbia was urgent. And nearly 40% saw that Kosovo's territorial integrity should not be sacrificed if it meant finalizing a deal with Serbia. Now, these were asked in opposition to each other, so I wouldn't say these are final figures, but it does show that folks in Kosovo are not terribly interested in territory swaps, which were once a big discussion in the dialogue with Serbia. And I'll point out as well that few are willing to say that the dialogue is not a priority issue between Kosovo and Serbia and would rather see it extended over the years in comparison to these other options. Also importantly, at this point in time, 74% of people want the US and the EU to guarantee Kosovo's territorial integrity. Again, not seeing much support for proposed land swaps between the two countries, which I don't want to reinforce the idea, but when they were proposed, for those who aren't aware, it would have theoretically involved switching, some of the southern parts of Serbia, where there's a predominantly Albanian population, and northern parts of Kosovo with a predominantly Serb population, which poses a number of democratic and interethnic challenges. We saw a continuing trend. This has been true in Kosovo for many years, very positive views of the US, NATO, and the EU. That is not at all uncommon. We did see, and this is interesting given some of the global trends related to vaccine diplomacy around this time, that support for China and support for Russia tended to decline compared to 2019. So we aren't seeing some of those messages penetrate the general population in Kosovo quite as much. And I'll point out as well that also, as usual, among the Serb population, represented here in red, basically every one of those trends is reversed. Conversely, the Serb community is more inclined to see China and Russia favorably, but not the US, NATO, or EU. The one place where Kosovo general population and Albanians and Kosovo Serb population kind of see eye to eye when it comes to international actors seems to have been Israel. At the time when this poll was fielded, Kosovo and Israel had just established diplomatic relations formally between each other. And in fact, Kosovo had just about a month prior opened an embassy in Jerusalem for the first time. Other top issues in Kosovo coming out of those elections and looking ahead to fall elections that occurred October 2021, so about 6 months after this poll was taken. Kosovars in general were a little more buoyant and optimistic than they had been in the fall. These purple colors here represent April in the top row. Most folks, about a third, are thinking Kosovo is going in the right direction, which is an increase over any time in 2020. And far fewer are thinking Kosovo is heading in the wrong direction. We don't know for sure everything that might influence this, but were we to speculate based on some public narratives and just other things we know to be going on in the political context, these could be coming out of the spring election, right? Kosovo's got a government again, and it's potentially got a majority to govern. It could be the incoming vaccines, and it could be spring, which is just, a happier time for many people globally. So these are just our best guesses, but there's a couple of reasons this could be the case. We see that folks have a general priority for vaccination and recovery from COVID-19 in this time. It's still very much top of mind, but we see this growing and largely increasing concern about corruption, and not just concern about it, actually identifying it as a priority for Kosovo and for its government. Unemployment is consistently a big concern in Kosovo, and unemployment and jobs are consistently across our region big concerns. So it's even more interesting to look at those that follow after. And here, corruption is the first thing after unemployment that citizens are concerned about. In fact, that was a big point of discussion and narrative during the parliamentary elections. Digging into that a little bit, we wanted to know what citizens expected of their new government. And the biggest things they wanted to see were effective measures for vaccines and fighting COVID-19, which again, that was really just beginning at this time. Folks also really wanted to see job creation, again, a consistent priority for Kosovars, and also measures against corruption. So we see if, corruption had to come at the cost of, the fight for COVID-19 at this point in time, at least Kosovo would choose COVID. But I don't think that really expresses quite enough how much people do care about corruption, because it's been growing in leaps and bounds as part of public concern for a few years. In the Serb community, although there's some similar concerns here, in general, they would increasingly prioritize dialogue with Serbia, and they care a lot more about interethnic tensions than those in the general population. Going along with something of a more buoyant mood coming out of these elections, we saw a general increase for most of Kosovo's public institutions in terms of how folks thought they were doing trust-wise, right? So Kosovo, folks in Kosovo saw the National Assembly, for example, as more trustworthy, here at 33% trustworthy than it was in November or even back in May 2020. The government too, suffered a drop from May to November and then increased again here. I think some of the trends we could be seeing here is that Kosovo, like other countries around the world that NDI has surveyed, saw a bit of a bump in many public institutions in terms of support for or faith in them right at the outset of the pandemic, when folks were inclined to really throw their support behind the government and be appreciative of all the measures that were undertaken. And that has ebbed over time and has sort of normalized more in line with historic trends, and then is more subject to some of the other domestic factors. One institution I wanted to highlight in particular is the decline of trust in media from May on to November and into April 2021. We'll talk about this more in just a moment when it comes to the information environment in Kosovo overall, but that's definitely something that stood out to us and something that we're working to better understand through our work on disinformation and other harmful information tactics. Thinking again about priorities for the legislature, corruption again was cited as the top legislative priority for the new government of Kosovo by far, by more than 39%. And when we asked how they might envision that working, what is it that citizens have in mind when they think about fighting corruption? They want to see strong rules fighting nepotism in the public sector, seizing of illegally acquired property and assets, public transparency in hiring. So a lot related to jobs and sort of the high profile asset requisition. All right. So following all of this, and in this moment, we're just sitting in between elections in Kosovo, as I mentioned. Local government elections were coming up in October 2021 at the time we took this poll. Since then, we've of course had the elections and seen the results of them. So this poll does sort of presage some of the trends that we ended up seeing in that election. In those elections, Vedovindosia, which had won the parliamentary elections and secured a governing majority, lost mayors in two of Kosovo's largest municipalities, which is to say Pristina and Prizren. It did not gain any additional local assemblies, but they did pick up a fourth mayor overall. I think coming out of the parliamentary elections, expectations among political Kosovo watchers was that LVV Vedovindosia would do a bit better than this, given how much they had gained in terms of public support and campaigning through the parliamentary election. Not surprisingly, given COVID, folks were very concerned about healthcare coming into the October local elections. And in fact, we did see that play out in the political party campaign narratives. Healthcare, education, local infrastructure were all priorities in the campaigns ultimately. And management of the COVID-19 pandemic following a spike in just ahead of the local elections in cases in Kosovo did become a greater point of discussion. Which takes us to our next topic, which is information integrity. We saw in our own analysis a fair amount of harmful narratives, is what I'll call them, in both sets of elections. That can be just genuine disinformation, false information. It also includes harmful speech and violence against women in politics, which is, again, quite common, unfortunately. And it also includes some particularly harsh, divisive political language that we saw coming from all sides. this is something that NDI is globally increasing its study of and responses to, and has been for some years now, including in Kosovo. We're wanting to understand in Kosovo in particular, the drivers of harmful information, the patterns of consumption among its citizens, so that we can help Kosovo itself and the civil and political actors there design solutions and preventative measures. So in Kosovo, we haven't seen major attacks or high-level disruptions to the information space like other countries have seen. So, and even other countries in the region. And so we think Kosovo is at a bit more of a preventative stage. There are significant risk factors in Kosovo that suggest the prevention will be really important here. And so that's a big priority for us over the coming years. The time is really now to be bolstering the information environment before it weakens further and becomes more difficult to improve and repair. So if you remember back a few slides, we saw declining trust in media as an institution as a whole. When we ask citizens about their most trusted sources of information in general, we can kind of see that reflected as well, with some drops in support, for example, for TV stations and certainly for social media, which is interesting. We see an increase in support, though, in relatives and friends as trusted purveyors of information. And that's particularly noticeable among the Serb community, where compared to the general population, the trust of relatives, friends, neighbors, and colleagues is far higher as a source of information. And in general, the Serb community has very different information access than the rest of the Kosovo population, in part due to language segmentation. Most of the Serb media that comes into Kosovo is in fact Serbian, so coming out of Serbia proper and Belgrade, though there are some high quality and dedicated news outlets that are specifically based in Kosovo, and particularly in the north and other Serb majority communities. And so part of, I think, this declining trust is that people do believe, about 74%, that online news sites sometimes or regularly report false information. And folks think that happens mostly for financial reasons, that online portals and those behind them are doing this for financial gain. And 71% believe that false information in general is being spread on Kosovo's social media. But despite all of this awareness, when asked how they would go to verify a piece of information that they saw online to be kind of interesting or unusual, most people would turn to friends and family as their first source of fact checking or information verification. And while we, of course, all trust our friends and family, right? These social bonds are very important. It can be a mixed blessing, right? Word of mouth is very easily shifted. Like, think about the game of telephone. Messages get passed along and changed very easily from one telling to the next. And when folks are confirming within their own sort of social bubbles and spheres, you can have problems of confirmation bias, everyone just sort of agreeing with the one worldview that they're similarly presented. And once harmful narratives are picked up within that circle, they can be very easily reinforced. And that's something we see in some of our research across the region as a problem as well. And it's something that we see growing in Kosovo. And so again, despite this heavy skepticism that folks in Kosovo have about sources of information, we do see susceptibility to false narratives. Here are COVID-19 narratives as an example. 35% believe that coronavirus is created to cause deaths and reduce the global population, just for example. And another third think that coronavirus cases are exaggerated so that the government can get foreign money and things like that. So it's not a huge proportion of the population, but it's a large portion of the population, especially given the skepticism that folks otherwise report towards the media in Kosovo. And so I'm going to hand it over to Brooklyn now to talk a bit more about the trends we see related to gender and COVID-19. And then we'll take questions following that.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, so first we're going to look at some of our polling on gender and specifically as it relates to women in politics. Again, as Elizabeth has mentioned, it's really important to keep in mind the context at the time of this poll, coming on the heels of the February parliamentary elections, where, again, we saw record numbers of women being elected and record numbers of women entering into leadership positions. And so, somewhat expectedly, we saw a general increase in optimism amongst the public about women in politics in terms of sort of the obstacles that they face. And so if we look at asking, why we don't see more women in top leadership positions, again, we see a pretty dramatic increase in optimism, both in terms of looking at sort of the more structural obstacles that women might be facing, such as being held back by male leadership in their parties, and in testing, sort of the misogynistic views of respondents about, how they perceive the sort of intrinsic qualities of women in politics. So, women not being tough enough for politics, or just simply not making as good of leaders as men. So again, in those more structural obstacles, we see, a 20% or 20-point drop compared to November 2020, and people thinking that active women are being held back, and that's why we don't see more women in top leadership positions. And again, that continued high level of people sort of denying those misogynistic narratives and retaining that belief that, it's not because women aren't tough enough or they don't make as good of leaders, which is, of course, a good thing to retain high levels of people rejecting those narratives. And then in looking at sort of the violence against women in politics and how people are perceiving those different forms of, targeted harassment, of just in general facing, violence for being in politics at all. We saw the same trend continue, an increase in optimism. Most stark is in looking at that, there's a 13% drop in people reporting that they agreed with the statement that violence against women in politics is widespread. And so it's important to sort of look at this with a nuanced perspective. Of course, in thinking about people rejecting misogynistic narratives, we want to continue to see increasing and high levels of people rejecting those. But in thinking about an increase in optimism about the structural barriers that women are facing, it's not necessarily encouraging result to see an increase in optimism. On the one hand, it could represent a decrease in that barrier of just in general public attitudes. If everyone doesn't think that women are being, or if everyone thinks that women are being held back in politics, we would expect that fewer women would be wanting to get involved in politics. So on the one hand, it does sort of represent a lowering of a barrier in and of itself. But on the other hand, if that increase in optimism is not aligned with the lived experiences of women in politics, it's not necessarily a good thing that people aren't seeing these barriers as important factors holding women back. It makes it harder for women to sort of get the resources that they need and really get the buy-in that they need to increase their representation or to combat these different forms of violence that they're facing. And we did see at the local level in the local elections, we didn't necessarily see overwhelmingly positive results. There was definitely progress. Kosovo nominated the most mayors it ever has, but that was most women mayors, but that was 2 female mayors because previously the record was 1. So in its history, Kosovo's elected 3 women mayors. And so on the one hand, local elections represented some progress, but on the other hand, it really just marks how far there is to go. And so in turning to sort of, again, returning to COVID-19, to sort of reiterate that this poll came right as the vaccination campaign in Kosovo was starting. And so, comparing April 2021 to November 2020, I think we all know those are very different times in the COVID pandemic, and that things can change pretty rapidly. So in general, of course, we saw an increase in optimism between November and April of just generally where the country was heading. What's really interesting is, again, looking at the sources of information people are trusting. As Elizabeth was talking about, we're really looking and honing in on the impacts of disinformation. And so while, again, we saw people reporting sort of that skepticism that Elizabeth was talking about, particularly when we look at COVID-19, we see that things like traditional and social media resources do have pretty high levels of trust in them. Around 60% of people turn to those resources when thinking about where they should get information about COVID and what they should be doing. We do still see high levels of trust in public health institutions, which is great. But when those are rivaled by people's trust in their friends and family, and again, in those traditional and social media sources, it really demonstrates that, again, we're in this preventative phase of combating disinformation disorders, and this sort of shows why that's so important. If we have so many people trusting in those sources, and these are the types of sources that are so susceptible to misinformation, disinformation, and all these other sort of information threats, that's why it's so important to sort of try to prevent as much of a breakdown in information integrity as possible. And so in looking at people's willingness to get vaccinated, we see generally people are willing to get vaccinated. A majority of people are willing to get vaccinated. We see really interesting differences, particularly in looking at the different age groups. So, somewhat expectedly, we see the oldest age groups, the 65 plus, being the most willing to get vaccinated. And there's about a 30% gap between the oldest group and the youngest group of 18 to 24-year-olds. And so, again, with older people being the most at risk of serious complications from COVID-19, of course, we'd expect them to be the most willing to get vaccinated. But in sort of thinking about what else might be informing this pretty large gap, we also know that young people are more likely to be really active on social media. And so if those are the sources that are containing false narratives, that also can be informing why there is such a big gap between young people's willingness to get vaccinated and older communities. And we see, again, a really stark divide in the Albanian versus the Serb community. Over 20% gap in the Serb community versus the Albanian community willing to get vaccinated. Again, this draws on the fact that, as Elizabeth mentioned, these two communities are looking at and absorbing very different sources of information. They're trusting in different sources, they're getting different types of information. And so that's definitely a factor here and why there's such a large divide. And I think it really just speaks to the distance between these two groups, and sort of thinking back to what Elizabeth was mentioning at the top about the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. Even when it comes to COVID-19 vaccinations, we see that there is a good bit of distance between these two groups. And so thinking about how we can really overcome a lot of these divides is critical to being able to progress. And now I think Elizabeth has some closing remarks, and then we'll be available for some questions.
Thanks. Just to sum up, there's a lot of information here. We'll share again the link to the full presentation so you can stare and digest to your heart's content. And we're going to continue to be using this research and fresh research that we have coming in and coming up to inform all of our activities, our approaches to disinformation, our approaches to intercommunal cooperation and to the extent possible, reconciliation. For example, we see signs of hope in both communities uniting around environmental issues, right? So we'll be looking into all of the possible openings we see to increase inclusion and promote good governance in Kosovo. And I don't know, Rob, if you had any closing thoughts as well.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Brooklyn. No, I'll go ahead and hold fire and invite either Agon or others in the group to offer some thoughts or pose questions, and Tanya can follow your lead as well.
Sure. I think I'm going to ask Agon, but first I just want to make a comment because I was paying attention to the news today, and Joseph Borrell issued a statement. There's reporting in the region that he is positing that Kosovo's stalling on the dialogue. And when you look at the polling data, it's very clear. I would think that the political leadership knows that the idea of land swaps or giving up sovereignty is not popular with the Kosovo population. And so this poll, I think Mr. Borrell should be looking at the NDI poll. It might inform him somewhat, on why there is a reluctance to move forward with Serbia, and perhaps in a compromised manner with their own voters and their own citizenry. That's an observation. I'm not asking anybody to respond to it, but over to you, Agon. I think I would like to hear some of your ideas, of course.
Thanks, Tanya, and thanks, Rob, Elizabeth, and Brooklyn for your excellent remarks and the interesting data of the poll. Things move very fast in the Balkans, in Kosovo, and these are data from April and May, but they're still very, very relevant because a lot of these, I have a sense that a lot of these sort of the sentiment is still valid on a lot of these issues. I look forward to some of your new polls to see how things have moved. I'll make a couple of remarks, comments on how I sort of reflections on top of these insights, and then I only have one question for clarification on one of the questions, and hopefully you can clarify. So I'll start with a little bit of the global outlook. I mean, it's clear that that for Kosovo, remains staunchly Euro-Atlanticist, and you can see that the 4.8 ranking for the U.S. especially remains very high. Although it's worth noting that that the one for the EU is lower. And I think, since you mentioned Tanya Borrell's statement, this is now, there are growing grievances over the EU's position on Kosovo, and I think this is something to be noted. This will play a role going forward, particularly with relation to the dialogue, because the perception in Kosovo is that the asymmetric treatment of the EU, in this case, sort of. The narrative increasingly is that, while Kosovo is actually recognized by 22 countries, the EU's policy is more like status neutral now. So the 5 non-recognizers are in a way dictating the foreign policy of the EU. And sort of this is asymmetric treatment in relation to Serbia. So the pressure is being put on Kosovo. And just to point out, for those who are interested, just this year, together with my colleague Dani Lazi, we've written this very thorough analysis, this paper, as part of the Western Balkan Task Force of the IRI, your colleagues at the International Republican Institute, on the emerging cracks in Kosovo's Euro-Atlantic consensus, what we call. So, Kosovo remains staunchly pro-transatlantic, pro-Western, but there are what we call emerging cracks, which result both from domestic failures. So we're not under the illusion that Kosovo has not failed, or the elites are not failing in several fronts in building the narratives about world affairs. But they're also a reflection of these external weaknesses, or allies unable to push Kosovo in sort of consolidate Kosovo or give it a Euro-Atlantic perspective. Kosovo now wants to apply for EU membership. It can't because of the 5 non-recognized. It can't become a member of NATO. It does not have an open path. So this is now, and this idea that Kosovo now has to concede or make concessions has created this sort of tension and this feeling that Euro-Atlantic sort of has created open grievances with the allies, particularly in relation to the EU, and has fed this what we call a more of a sovereignist approach that, in my taste, in my view at least, the current government is taking a little bit a little bit more excessively than they should, and they should be treading more lightly. I would like to point on this sense, since we mentioned the news, the statements by DAS Escobar yesterday, pointing on issues such as the Association of Kosovo Serb Municipalities as, not necessarily having to be threatening to Kosovo's sort of integrity and functionality. That we can still have some milder versions of that that do not. So these kind of messages from the US are helpful, while the messaging from the EU has definitely not been helpful at all, and will continue to be a problem. On the dialogue, I really, the poll data shows that that's a reflection of the mood. People want the government to focus more on jobs and justice. That was the message of Prime Minister Kurti during the elections and after the elections. So in a way, it also reflects what he has been saying. My question was in relation to the territorial integrity. When you say only 37% don't want to sacrifice territorial integrity, that number seems a bit low. So I'm just wondering what was the specific framing there, because the objection to the land swap was much higher in previous polls, almost like 80 or 90%. So only 37% does seem a bit low. So I'm just maybe going to ask you to kind of comment on that. The public mood in Kosovo is against most of what are perceived as the solutions in the dialogue, either the ASM with executive powers or any land swap. There's a caveat here. The trust in the government is relatively high. So the prime minister has, and the president especially, they do have a lot of political capital, and they do have trust. So if they decide to kind of invest more or frame public discourse towards achieving some sort of solution, I do think there is space for them to succeed in the dialogue. But so far, they have not pushed public opinion in that direction. I'll make a couple of remarks also on some of the domestic issues. What's that kind of like sort of a zeitgeist now, and what has changed maybe from April and May when the poll was done. Kosovo has been in extreme political turbulence, not only during COVID or during the downfall of the previous government. It has been pretty much facing a lot of tensions since 2014. We've had at least 4 or 5 governments in as many number of years, but now I think the sense is that we're back to sort of more normal pace of politics with a government and an opposition, and it seems like there is a likelihood that this will be a government that will last an entire mandate. The mood is more confident, particularly about the state of the democracy. You can sense a sense of pride in relation to that. And some of the polling data also shows the importance of gender, of women especially, and youth being the key drivers of this. Either by showing up and voting for young people and for women, and you can see now a huge rise in representation, especially at central level institutions, of young people and women. But also as topics that drive engagement on like especially the gender issue. It's one of the topics that is now has mobilization potential. We are witnessing it almost every week or month, especially domestic violence cases. They're bringing out women protesting in front of police, in front of courts. Courts are reacting, or prosecution is responding to this pressure. Domestic abusers are not getting that much of a free pass, and this is really becoming a very pressing issue. So women and youth are really shifting the landscape, shifting the norms, and this has a lot to do with Kosovo's demographic structure. It has so many young people, and we're in the middle of a youth bulge, which is like the post-war baby boomers now. If you look at the population pyramid, we are right there at the peak right now. So that the 18 to 27-year-olds are really a huge number. And that really puts a lot of pressure on the political scene and on society to change more rapidly. I think the poll also indicates there's an increased trust in institutions, especially political level institutions, but not necessarily on judiciary and these kind of things that, so this is now will be the challenge of the current government. And this is, they are working on this. They are trying to kind of instigate some reforms, but these are really like structural, long-term reforms. It's going to be really hard to deliver on these things and improve the perception of these institutions in a very short time. So in a way, the government is running against the clock. It's running against the clock with a huge youth bulge, young people expecting jobs, expecting corruption to be fought, and those jobs cannot come fast, and the judiciary cannot be reformed very fast. So it's a battle against time for the government to implement what it promised that it will implement. And you can now already see signs of the erosion of trust happening. The local elections were one sign of that. But I'd like to highlight one important thing that has happened since the poll was done. Is the change that's happened in the opposition in the meantime. The electoral result of last February did not only produce a sort of a wave and a new government. It was revolutionary also in one sense that the opposition, realized that it has to change. And what we've seen since then is that you have new leaderships in both of the main opposition parties, more popular ones, and that was already reflected in the local elections with new opposition candidates winning the big cities. And if in the past as well, Pristina, the big cities were sort of indicators of where the trend is going, but Ndosje won there first before winning the national elections. The fact that the opposition won the two major cities is a sign that they have reflected and the voters are sort of responding to that. So and this also increases the pressure on the government. Some of the polling data also indicates this. There is an increasing number of already in this poll in May, in April, that percentage of people saying that the country is going in the right direction. I think it was like 34%. But the most of them are at 40% or neutral. So it's sort of, they are willing to give the government a chance. They are positive that, this was maybe a good change. But no, they're not going to give it a free pass. It's more of like a conditional support. So that 50% that was won in the election was not enthusiastic only. It was like, part of it was enthusiasm, but part of it was, we will give you a chance. And you're already seeing maybe a little bit of that trust, political support eroding on a lot of issues, management of COVID, now electricity prices, things that the government is to be blamed for, is not to be blamed for. Voters sometimes don't care. They want quick things to happen. So the government, I think, is now increasingly in a tight spot. Another thing that maybe is worth mentioning is the approval ratings of leaders, and you can see that the presidency is more popular than the government, and this is something to be noted. President Osmani has, and I would interpret this as President Osmani as being more of a consensual figure or having a broader appeal than Prime Minister Kurti. So far, I think this has to do more of it with the perception that they're different. So far, they haven't differed much on policy, on any of the major issues. But the perception is that she is more of a pro-transatlantic, more pro-US than Prime Minister Kurti. So I think that difference is reflected there. Whether the situation evolves into where they have any disagreements, I would not like to speculate on that, but I think it's worth pointing out that the current government is actually in a way a coalition between these two leaders and these two popular figures. And this is one dynamic that is worth watching as we go forward. Two other very important issues, it was discussed enough, I think, about the media. I think it's a very important topic to discuss, but I'd like to focus on two that maybe reflect on two issues that are very important going ahead. One is the ethnic distance, which remains very high. And I think has grown over the last couple of years, especially after the border correction discussion. I think that we've had a deterioration in ethnic relations. And these sporadic, continuous incidents, especially in the north, have increased mistrust. So I think the government needs to do a bit of a better job in terms of outreach while having this, it's okay to have this disagreement with Serbia. I think they need to do a better job to reach out to local Serbs, to Kosovo Serbs, in terms of messaging, to reduce some of the legitimate fears or concerns that they might have in the current context. And so I think that is an issue also worth noting. Last but not least, it's not mentioned here in this poll, but if you look at other polls, migration, I think the last election in Kosovo was really important. And I think a lot of the countries have had this moment where a lot of people invest a huge amount of hope in a political option. But my fear was, even when the elections happened, was that my fear was that these hopes the expectations were too high for any government. Even the best possible government in Kosovo cannot deliver fast and deliver at the rate that people expect with that, especially with the demographic structure and the nature of the political economy in Kosovo. So now I fear that, and if you look at the polls, a lot of people are looking to migrate. If you look at the statistics, for example, from the German embassy, the sheer number of people who are applying for working visas. I think now people will move a little bit more from political options or engagement to exit. With this, a massive sort of moment of hope can very easily turn into massive disillusionment. And so I think going forward, this will be now a challenge in managing the expectations that were built last year. Part of it is I fear the fault of the current government elite. I think when they were in opposition, they've built the expectations a bit too high, or put everything that was wrong in Kosovo was wrong because of the old elite. But now that they're running things themselves, you realize that some things are just structural challenges. Like electricity prices. It's a global phenomenon. It's a global trend. But now they're caught in a context where they'll have to explain or look like they're flip-flopping. And this is particularly important also for the dialogue, like the issue of the Association for Serbian majority municipalities. A huge part of the responsibility on why it's difficult for Kosovo to move ahead now on this is because the current government, or when it was in opposition, really was staunchly against this. So now they've reduced the space that they need to be constructive and find some solutions as part of the dialogue because of the discourse that they build in opposition. So I'm sorry for taking a bit too much time, but I just wanted to kind of reflect a little bit on top of the data, using some of the insights from there, and hopefully provide some additional insight for the audience. So thank you.
Very interesting comments. I just want to say really quickly, I want to give NDI credit for the polling data on gender. And let me just say, this affirms actually issues that are happening and have been happening, that women journalists are targeted throughout the region. And it's quite aggressive and it's very dangerous, actually. So this is kind of consistent. And I would add what Agon is talking about, this youth bulge, is that a great book out, and it's the academic in me, is a book by Valerie Hudson, The First Political Order, How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide. Happens to be been published by Columbia University Press. That's not why I'm pushing it. I think this is a handbook for all of us who are working on democratization, transitional justice, because as Agon has pointed out about women, it's true throughout the region that women, now you have a woman mayor in Sarajevo who happens to be Jewish. Women are emerging throughout the region in leadership positions. And actually, I think Kosovo has been very strong on women in terms of ministers. They really have, I think, led in a lot of ways. I think Osmani is a very attractive leader. I think she comes off very well. I think it's very interesting to watch, especially for those of us like Rob and I who've been working on this region for a long time. It's very interesting to see these people emerge and seeing women in this new generation really not going to stand for it, perhaps. And you see that also in the LGBTI movement, where people are just coming out. They're saying, I'm going to live my life, and this is the way it's going to be. And a lot of women are leading that as well. So I just, I want to give due credit to NDI for this information. And thank you, Agon, for your comments. We do have a question. I'm going to share it with everybody. It's from Amanda Brown, and she asks, in terms of trust in public institutions, have you been tracking perceptions of Serb institutions in Kosovo? Have you observed changes in attitudes and perceptions toward them? Who wants to take that?
I can.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of NDI's research, we have not been tracking that recently. We have, of course, tracked the overall perception of institutions. I think it would be fair to expect them to be different, but there are challenges I'll flag just in general in research and polling and conversation with the Serb community, because we find them a lot more reluctant and a lot less open in conversations. If you look at disaggregations over the years of the Serb community, there's a lot more responses that are, I don't know, I'm not sure, and so on. And now many things can drive that, but one of the things that could be driving that, and that's consistency over the years on questions that, we might otherwise expect based on focus group research or popular narratives to be a little more solidified. Could be just like a reluctance to speak openly, even in a context like public opinion research that is set to be as, safe and reassuring and anonymized as possible.
I'll just jump in on this. I think that there is I think Kosovo Serb communities have a sort of double challenge here. One is a very strong form of political management, let's call it that, coming directly from Belgrade, is viewed in the political process where essentially the lone political party in Kosovo representing Kosovo Serb communities is seen to be effectively managing their participation together with Belgrade, and not without at times some reason and cause and grievance absenting itself from political life and political institutions. At the same time, I think Kosovo Serb communities should not be viewed precisely as monolithic. You have geographic disparities between the northern municipalities, which geographically and perhaps politically are a little bit more affixed to Belgrade, and communities in central and southern parts of Kosovo that traditionally are a little bit more integrated with Albanian and other neighbors. And there's a kind of a pluralism in Kosovo Serb communities that is kind of hoping to break through a little bit. Not that they shouldn't have a cohesive form of political representation, but I think there's more work that can and needs to be done there. But when you look at the prospect of placing trust in either in Serbian institutions, be they part of the Kosovo system or still vestiges of a quote unquote parallel system, I think Kosovo Serbs in many communities feel a little frustrated in both senses. And for them, it seems these existential questions of how do we see ourselves in what polity and how can we maximize our opportunities, economic, social, and otherwise, really still stand at the forefront of their interests. I think every day in Kosovo that can be an integration day is a good day. When it comes to the communities, we champion that in Bosnia and Herzegovina as well. And I will say that Kosovo, as Agon rightly pointed out, has a lot of it has to be attuned to what's going on around it. So Kosovo, in terms of its relations with wider Europe, the events playing out in Ukraine right now with Russia will have consequence for Kosovo, as it will for Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Association of Serb Municipalities, which was seen to be a pretty fundamental political piece in the 2013 Brussels Agreement that Kosovo at the time did sign on to, will be viewed with respect to events in Bosnia and Herzegovina as concerns recent efforts by the president of Republika Srpska to remove the RS from state institutions in contravention of the Dayton Peace Agreement. So Kosovo has its own domestic realities, but those realities are very much attuned to and directly influenced by external events. Having said all that, I think when you look at the region, I'll extrapolate a little bit from that. When you look at the region overall, Kosovo is a country in the Western Balkans that is singularly and somewhat paradoxically perhaps most closely connected to the West. I say paradoxical because it is also probably the most distanced in terms of European Union membership and NATO membership compared to its neighbors. There's a sort of odd paradox where the closer you get to these things, the lack of consensus there appears to be. But I think Agon's comment on not just assuming Kosovo's unyielding and unwavering commitment to transatlantic integration, that has to be kept at, that has to be cultivated, that has to be nurtured because of what are clearly impediments in the broader enlargement and integration process that we see for the Western Balkans overall. And that is something that is relatively new in terms of this, on the one hand, the development and the consolidation of democratic processes, and in Kosovo's case is a new country, that together with the synonymous and we hope concurrent integration process into the transatlantic community. So there's a lot of fulmination as a result at present when you zoom out to a regional level.
Very interesting comments. And
can we go back quickly to your question, Agon, on that 37% on the territorial exchange? I think that was designed, Elizabeth, as it wasn't a singular question. It was a series of statements and people had to choose among them. And so it should be seen in relative terms, not absolute, but Elizabeth can confirm that.
That's correct. And the question is back up again here, but I'll point to better draw what you were saying, Agon, to this other slide, in which 74% of respondents said the US and EU should guarantee territorial integrity. Since then, we've been playing with question design on these issues, but frankly, because we see territorial integrity as less popular, as shown here, and we want to be able to focus on other issues that might bring people together or drive them apart on the dialogue. I do think we have another.
Yeah, we do. Yes, we do. I'm just getting ready I was waiting to see if there's going to be a comment. This is from an anonymous person, but they state, as a young Bosnian, I'm very much interested in this research because we share a lot of the same challenges as Kosovo citizens, since population of youth is biggest in the region, but also support of general public for EU, also one of the biggest in the region. I'm wondering, will Kosovo be able to prevent the process of brain drain once Kosovo citizens are free from the Schengen visa regime? Who would like to take that? Is there anybody that wants to take that?
I can start. I'd welcome others' views as well. I think that is a big question for Kosovo right now. I think we're seeing in Kosovo, as in Bosnia, right, that there is out migration already. And I think what will really have to happen to prevent that is for Kosovo to help craft a future for young people. What does it mean to see your future in Kosovo? Yes, it means job opportunities. And that is linked, these bread and butter issues for young people as much as anyone else, to more existential issues like the dialogue. And this is something you drew out, Agon, but I don't really see the priority of the dialogue in opposition to jobs and unemployment, but it's clear that people themselves don't see that link. So without that resolution, it will be much harder to create jobs, to create opportunities for young people, and to continue to like shrink the distance between communities, which is in fact growing for young people. And I think because of the demographic points that Agon raised about the youth bulge and others, we're seeing so much more interest in and response to young people's concerns in Kosovo. So I think there has to continue to be momentum across all levels of government in understanding youth concerns, because they're not like, monolithic. Youth are a huge portion of the population in Kosovo. And so within that, there's an immense number of identities and viewpoints that need to be considered and addressed. And so I think this is, I hope, a moment that will continue to inspire like listening and response to youth priorities as they grow in demographics, as they grow as a voting force. We saw it, at least according to exit polls in Kosovo, that women and youth were really decisive in the 2021 parliamentary elections. And so I think as that political impetus grows and the desire for new faces in politics grows and continues, I would hope that Kosovo can respond to that moment and therefore meet this challenge of brain drain.
Can I just maybe add a few points? I think absolutely it's a really difficult structural challenge. Trust in institutions is really important to have people stay and give Kosovo a shot. But this is not a problem that only Kosovo is facing. We're seeing this across the Western Balkans and even in countries like Croatia, which is an EU member. So this outward migration, westward migration, part of it has been a normal. It's been a trend throughout Eastern Europe, and Kosovo is no different in this sense. It has the extra pressure of having this just that amount of youth, and it's so that youth, they might be happy with the level of governance or the trust. They might trust that the leaders are not corrupt, but it will be difficult to provide that many jobs and labor-intensive industries coming in that fast. So I really expect that migration to continue with or without visa liberalization. It's happening. Germany has opened the gates for skilled workers, and it is happening already. It might increase for a little while if visa liberalization happens. I think the key point is for a country like Kosovo that has a huge diaspora already, which is still very, very strongly connected to the homeland, is to make this migration circular. So, a lot of people will be going, and sometimes that's good because they gain skills, they get some capital, but to make it appealing to come back, especially for the skilled workers. So my biggest concern of the recent migration wave is not necessarily the unskilled workers. That's obviously tragic for a lot of people, the displacement, the economic displacement, but the skilled workers, the loss of skilled workers is a huge problem from a development perspective. Both, we've seen this in countries like Poland or Central Europe, where they went into regressive democratic trends because some of the more skilled labor, a lot of the more progressive urban population skilled, left, and that also turned the electorate a little bit more, more older, so that also had a political impact. But it also has a developmental impact because you will need the skilled workers to develop new industries that will create also the jobs for the low skilled ones. So for me, this is the biggest challenge for the Balkans and for Kosovo specifically as well. And just to point one thing out also in relation to the dialogue, it is being presented in Kosovo as this competition between jobs and justice and the dialogue. And I think this is a really big mistake because and it has to do with the framing of the elites. That they need to be more careful with this. They are presenting a lot that the dialogue as a threat. Whereas I do think and D.S. Escobar was correct in this. It's being offered to Kosovo as a way out from a deadlock, from a gridlock, which its Western partners have not created. They don't want it, but there are these non-recognizers in Europe. And there is this reality, external reality Kosovo faces, and the risks are amplifying, as Rob rightfully mentioned. So there is a need for Kosovo to use this window, and it does not necessarily have to cripple itself with institutions that resemble Republika Srpska or give away territory. There is a lot of space in between. So I guess, to conclude, I think the key thing right now for the new government, since they have this amount of trust, is to change the framing of this, either jobs, justice, or the dialogue. The dialogue, and to frame dialogue as an opportunity to get Kosovo out of this and bring in a new momentum that will also bring investments and create this sense of hope for the younger generation.
I can just add a Bosnia note to this, because we're working in Bosnia too. And in fact, we support a group of young politicians, Group 9, which spans 9 political parties, multi-ethnic and across the entities as well. They've been working on immigration, and in their research and advocacy, they found out a few things. One is it is definitely about economic opportunity, but it's also, secondly, about dignity, the sense that as a citizen, I have a role to play and I'm not going to be shut down by or essentially subject to corruption by those in power. So there's a dignity and opportunity element that coexist. As Agon describes, there's a crowding out process that happens when you're always talking about the dialogue process in Kosovo, when you're always talking about ethnic zero-sum politics in Bosnia-Herzegovina. You're not talking about these other issues. And those issues are about governance at the end of the day. They're about sound economic policy. They're about employment generation. They're about growing the private sector. They're about tackling corruption precisely. And sometimes that's used, the ethnic issues and these very large and important issues are somehow either leveraged to not have those discussions or simply to crowd out those types of policy discussions. And we found out in working, as Group 9 did, with some young entrepreneurs, that there's definitely a policy agenda here. I mean, there was a young woman, not 35, who had started an agribusiness in Mostar, and she said, I could hire 50 more people tomorrow to grow my business if I had better infrastructure to move my product to Sarajevo, if I didn't have to spend so much time and money dealing with public administration on all matters of red tape, and if labor policy was reformed to make it easier to hire and fire people. I could hire 50 more people tomorrow, but she can't. And so growing a private business in these environments can be very tricky indeed, much less creating supply chains and other forms. And that gets you into a much larger question about the role of the state in the economy in the Western Balkans. For Americanized, it seems rather large and perhaps too unwieldy in terms of the public sector kind of crowding out the private sector. But there's a whole debate there in terms of public administration reform, fiscal policy, infrastructure development that really does need to take place. We want to be in a position to support those in parliament, political parties, civil society, and business who want to have those conversations. But that's a big backdrop area to the migration phenomenon that we see.
We have another question, and I actually know Azra Burbic. She's involved at the Post-Conflict Research Center in Sarajevo and is a young journalist. She says, is there any recent national research on brain drain? Maybe. And secondly, and yes, I believe Kosovo has the biggest potential for reshaping brain drain into brain circulation on the region. Very interesting comment, Azra. Who wants to respond? No comments.
I would defer to Agon on this.
Okay.
His expertise.
In terms of research, I think the key, actually, administrative data is the working visas, with Germany, like 30 or 40,000 a year, which is very I think it was last year like 30,000.
Yes.
That's a lot for a country like Kosovo, and that's usually for skilled workers. And I'm pretty sure, I haven't seen, I mean, I'm pretty sure a lot of colleagues are doing this. I think GAP Institute has done some research on this. But I do agree with the idea that Kosovo has a lot of potential for circular. It has, a lot of the innovation and the investment that are happening now in the private sector are actually coming from the diaspora. Because they are connected to the value chains in Switzerland and in Germany. And now you see, for example, wood processors. Kosovar diaspora works a lot in Switzerland in the construction sector. They go back home and they start outsourcing some of these processes or materials, and now a lot of them are exporting to Switzerland and to Germany. Kosovo started now to export this year. Who's become the top export destination of Kosovo? It was almost zero 2 years ago. Now the top export destination is the US, because one manufacturer that is exporting mattresses to the US, like I guess they got a huge contract. So that's like, we're talking about almost tens of millions of dollars. So exports have increased 2 or 3-fold over the last 2 years. And a lot of it is coming from the diaspora, actually, because the diaspora has this very, very strong connection, and you can see it especially with the diaspora tourism. The amount of visits that they come back to Kosovo just for family visits. So I really do see a potential there, but in order for that to happen more often and to be a more sustainable phenomenon, I really do think that the governance has to improve. So that's where these long-term reforms have to be there, because these middle classes, these skilled workers especially, but not just them, in order for them to stay, they really have to, they're not looking just for jobs. They're looking for good education, good health. So just a job is not enough anymore, So really, I think for that circular migration to happen over the next 5-10 years, significant improvement has to happen in education and health, especially, and things like air quality. So that's why if you look at even your polls, you see these kind of issues now rising up much higher, even though they are being crowded out by these macro political things that Rob mentioned, this dialogue. But people are demanding more and more on these issues, and you saw this also in the local elections now. The politics is sort of increasingly focusing on these. But the tragic part is that just like in Bosnia, this geopolitical instability can very easily disrupt progress. Whether we like it or not, these problems come to us without us willing them. So I think it's going to be really difficult and a big challenge in the upcoming weeks and months, especially for Kosovo and Bosnia to see how this Ukraine situation impacts us before we can also talk about these big development issues.
We have another question and comment. What do you think explains the fact that Kosovo stands out so positively as an exception in the region regarding democratic standards like media freedom, space for critical civil society voices, change in government through elections, but also things like vaccine uptake? I'm going to make one really quick comment about the media landscape in Kosovo. It's one of the most free, one of the most dynamic in the region, as opposed to Serbia, which is one of the most locked down and propaganda-filled media environment. And Bosnia is somewhere in between, because it does have a pretty diverse media representation, but it aligns more ethnically, unfortunately. Does anybody want to take a stab at this in response to this comment and question?
I'll jump in to say I think Kosovo routinely over the last 15 years has registered more buoyant rates of support to institutions compared to other countries in the region. I would defer to Agon on this. I think that for many particularly but not uniquely, Kosovo Albanians fought for this. They fought for their independence. They fought for their sovereignty, and I think that there is a warts and all, there is a real strong identification with the institutions of the country that sometimes transcend performance. We see ups and downs, and it is by no means uniform or consistent, but relative to other countries in the region, those numbers tend to be a little bit more buoyant. And I do find that exceptional, buoyant both in the relative sense compared to other, but actually, north of 45, 50%. So in absolute terms as well, quite positive. There has been, and it'll be interesting to see let's say the infusion of support that has come to these institutions with the advent of the government, because I think the elections last year really did reflect a popular change of leadership that had been stymied in 2020 by what had been as Elizabeth mentioned, a very short term in office by Kurti, upended by a vote of no confidence that many saw sort of as an engineered situation, and his return to power and the ascension of Vjosa Osmani to the presidency, I think, did represent that fresh political leadership that we've been speaking about, and maybe with that an uptick in general support. But as Agon also mentions, we'll have to see how that plays out. Any government is challenged throughout its mandate, and this government will likely see its full mandate proceed. And so, and as these other issues come to the fore, and with migration and other challenges, plus trying to get ahead of the pandemic and trying to put it behind us, we'll have to watch those numbers going forward. And then, of course, I think the public's commitment to and interest in the dialogue process will be consequential as well to not only the performing of these institutions, but also to how the public perceives their own security and their own future.
We're going to have to wrap up. Azra's made another comment. She said, I know there's been a recent report on brain drain in Kosovo, so it got a lot of attention, but she's making a fair point here, I think. Brain drain is a regional issue for sure, but compare the data with Bosnia. Just in the first 17 days of November 2021, more than 170,000 people in Bosnia applied in the German embassy for a visa, and this information was confirmed by the embassy. So in other words, and she's also asserting that, yes, there are younger politicians in Bosnia, but many times they're following their older colleagues and they're not necessarily that independent thinking. And having worked on Bosnia for almost 31 years, I would say that there's some merit to her arguments, but we really need to go. It's 1:30. I want to thank NDI and I want to thank Agon very much for joining. Your polling data is exceptional. Please, please, please notify me. Elizabeth, please notify me in your next poll, because I will invite you back to us, and hopefully in person, I hope, in this coming year. All the comments, the data is very, very interesting. And Agon, is really great to have you here. You really elaborated on a lot of these trends in ways that none of us perhaps can. But very, very interesting and very, I'll share the link. You'll be able to get the link at the YouTube Harriman Institute account. And thanks again, everybody.